Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to Cold Case Files, and this is Friday Night Ghosts.
September 1983. I was in second grade. Friday nights, it was the family movie nights. We were up a little bit later than normal. And I remember my stepmother, Mary, stating that she had to run to the restaurant. I remember pulling the curtain out just a little bit, and I just kind of watched her drive off. I don't ever remember doing that before. I have, over the years, thought about Mary and David and Opie and Monty and Joey out there in that oil field. And there were just so many unanswered questions. Who? Why? What kind of monster it could have been to do that to them?
Kilgore was, an oil town, a very nice area, wholesome families. Everybody kind of knew everybody, and football was a big thing, being in Texas. At the Kilgore KFC restaurant, our biggest day of the week would be Friday because before the football games, mothers didn't have time to cook. The whole town was busy, busy, busy. Everybody was just gearing up for the big football night. My shift was from 11 to 7. I left and went home.
It's shortly before 12 a.m. KFC manager Leanne Raspberry is unwinding after her shift when the phone rings.
It was from the Kilgore Police Department that they were at the restaurant and that something wasn't right.
When she arrives at the restaurant, police tell Leanne what happened after she'd punched out. Assistant Manager Mary Tyler was about to close up for the night when her daughter, Kim Miller, came by for a visit.
When Kim got there, she had noticed the front door being locked, so she went around the back. The back door was wide open. Then nobody's there. My stepsister found the place in disarray. She immediately called my dad to see if Mary was at home.
At the end of every shift, Mary would deposit the day's cash in the bank.
Dad told her Mary wasn't there, and then they both were calling hospitals, emergency rooms to make sure there was no accident. Once they found out Mary wasn't in the ER, that's when he said, okay, let's call the police department.
Mary was a dear friend. We shared a lot of time together at work, and we talked a lot on the phone. She was a single mom for several years, and she would talk about working extra hours just to have enough to maybe buy something one of the kids needed for school. And she struggled. She struggled, I'm sure, because I was a single myself. And then Mary married Billy Tyler. And it was so sweet to see them together because she was about 5'2" and he was probably 6'2". She just loved it when he came in the restaurant, and he was pretty crazy about her.
I don't know what drew my dad and Mary together, but he says that she was the love of his life. We were from divorced parents, didn't have a mom around for a while. And then Mary come in the picture, and it was a family.
She already had 3 kids of her own, Tony, him, and Bubba, and had no problem taking in 2 more.
Mary was as proud of them as if they were her biological children. She would just brag on them and say what neat things they had done. And her son was probably 7 at the time. He was handicapped. He had some disabilities, and she just, oh Lord, she loved that boy. And he loved his mother.
Even though she'd work a day shift at the Kentucky Fried Chicken, she'd come home and she'd cook a meal, and we talked during dinner.
She took us underneath her wing and just like we were her own.
We were hers.
An officer walked with me through the restaurant, I guess, to get a picture of what may have happened. All the money had been taken out of the registers, and there was a good bit of blood kind of spattered, and things were scattered like there had been a struggle. Well, the police were curious to know who should be there, so we went and looked at the time cards.
When police checked Mary's time card, they find she hadn't punched out for the night. Neither had her co-workers, 20-year-old Joey Johnson and 39-year-old mother of 3, Opie Hughes.
Their vehicles were there, but they weren't. My gut just, you hear people say my heart failed. That's what it was. It was fear.
Police are about to start a search for the missing employees when a young woman arrives in a panic. She says her husband, David Maxwell, is missing.
David Maxwell was also an employee of the Kentucky Fried Chicken and was a frat brother with Joey Johnson. Lana informed law enforcement that David had gone up to the KFC to meet up with Joey when he got off work, along with another frat brother, Monty Landers. David and Monty had been hanging out in the restaurant waiting for Joey to get off.
We found out that Monty Landers and David Maxwell were also missing. I was in disbelief. It was a void and a hollowness and a fear for their safety. We waited for them all night at the police station thinking they're okay and they're going to get to a phone and, they're going to be found.
An employee of an oil field out in rural Rusk County, 12 or so miles from the KFC restaurant, was driving to the wells when he sees 4 people lying next to the road.
And so he yells at them to get up, thinking maybe there's just been some sort of party and these people have fallen asleep. He walks up there and realizes that they're dead.
man was in rural Rusk County checking his oil derricks when he sees 4 people lying next to the road. He goes up to them and discovers that they are all 4 deceased.
Investigators determined fairly quickly that these are the folks who matched the description from the Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in Kilgore. A couple of them were wearing uniforms, but there are only 4 of them.
They were in a row from left to right. They are identified as Joey, Mary, David, and Monty. They were all lying on their stomachs with their heads on their hands. They were shot in the back of the head or in the back multiple times apiece. This was an execution.
Police spread out looking for evidence. They soon find the 5th victim, Opie Hughes.
She too was lying on her stomach and was shot multiple times. And the theory was that she had tried to run.
And so they called upon the assistance of the Texas Rangers. They're essentially Texas' version of the Bureau of Investigation.
There was very little evidence at the scene. Their bodies and the bullets, and that was it.
Investigators are baffled. 5 people brought to a remote oil field 12 miles from where they were abducted were lined up and murdered. It shocks even the most veteran detectives.
Mass murder on that scale in '83 was just unthinkable. It was just beyond the pale of anything that they had ever envisioned.
When I found out what had taken place, I don't even know how I absorbed it. It was like my whole world just fell apart. At KFC, we were kind of like family. That was our social life outside of our home. And we had watched each other's children grow up and we're involved in each other's lives. And I couldn't help but feel just awful that Mary's children wouldn't ever see her again. And Opie's children. It's just hard to imagine that.
I remember my dad getting a phone call, and I remember him going outside and just kind of breaking down on his truck. And then the next thing I remember is Kim, my stepsister, pulling into the driveway, and she was in hysterics. She couldn't stop her car. So I remember someone like kind of slipping into the driver's side window and like pulling the emergency brake.
The investigation starts at the last place all 5 victims were seen, the KFC.
Texas Ranger Glenn Elliott is looking at things and notices a box lid with a distinctive blood spatter pattern. Blood spatter science is just starting to take off. And he believes that it's high velocity and that somebody's been hit and that blood's moved that way and hit that box lid. And in the back room, there's a napkin, and he forms the opinion that was cast off blood, just like somebody had had a bloody nose or something. And so that did interest that ranger, but it didn't necessarily interest most officers at the time. Fingerprint was the science of the day in 1983. And so they were really going heavy with fingerprint dust and trying to lift prints from cash register, from the counter, from everywhere.
Each of the 5 victims was taken to Dallas for autopsy. They were able to determine that at least 2 different weapons were used, a .38 and a .357, and there could have possibly been a third weapon because there were several different kinds of bullets. So they knew that they were looking for at least 2 shooters, possibly 3.
The medical examiner begins the autopsies for all 5 victims.
When they were doing Joey's autopsy, a fingernail fell out of the waistband of his jeans. And he did not have any torn fingernails.
And the ranger was convinced that this must belong to the killer. And so they're immediately looking for this person who may be missing a fingernail.
The day that it actually set in with Denise and I was the day of her funeral. Then we realized Mary is not coming home.
I remember Davy's funeral, carrying his casket, and there's still this disbelief this hadn't happened. I first met David, I can't remember exactly if it was 8th or 9th grade. David was a new guy in school, and he was just a laid-back guy. He laughed a lot.
David was very kind, considerate. He was married to a sweet girl and had just found out that they were pregnant and was over the moon, just living life large.
And then I remember the funeral ending. It was back to this, why aren't they doing something? Why hadn't there been an arrest made? The events that happened are almost like an anchor that drew me in the direction of law enforcement. Made a decision to go to the academy to become a police officer.
Law enforcement were talking to all of the ne'er-do-wells in town. General Mankins Jr. was just generally kind of known as one of the local troublemakers. His father was a former state legislator who was very well respected, General Mankins Sr., but Jr. had problems with the law for a number of years. He was a known drug dealer.
They bring Jimmy Mankins Jr. in to be questioned. He willingly comes in, does a non-custodial interview, and they end up examining his hands because they already have the lead of the fingernail.
And that's when they noticed that the middle finger on his right hand, the fingernail was torn all the way down to the quick.
That KFC restaurant reopened, and I was scared. You were jumpy and nervous, and several employees quit. I would think about all of them all the time. Often, something would trigger a memory. Sometimes somebody will say something funny that makes you think about Joey. He was a prankster, and people saying, "Oh, Joey," and it was extremely hard.
As loved ones say their last goodbyes, detectives get their first solid lead. A a missing fingernail on the hand of 30-year-old Jim Earl Menkins, Jr.
Law enforcement took a whole bunch of pictures of his finger, and then they took a clipping of that same fingernail after it had grown out.
In 1983, the prevailing view in the forensic scientific community was that fingernails were distinctive, just like fingerprints, and they'd be able to look on the underside of the fingernail and see what they refer to as striations through a microscope.
Investigators send the clippings to a Dallas lab, where techs can compare them to the fingernail found on Joey Johnson during his autopsy. They also dig deeper into Menkins.
On the date of the murders, Jimmy Menkins Jr. just gotten out of jail for unlawfully having a weapon.
The weapon was confiscated, and he borrowed another weapon, a .38 as I recall, from one of his friends, and there was a .38 that was believed to be one of the murder weapons. And the ballistics guys told him, I can't say this .38 is any more the gun that killed these people than any other .38 on earth. But, I mean, him having a .38 definitely moved him up in the category of people that law enforcement was interested in.
When this all occurred, there was lots of rumors that drugs were being sold out of like the drive-through window at the Kentucky Fried Chicken, and that someone at the restaurant had a drug recipe.
There were rumors that hidden somewhere inside that KFC was the recipe for high-grade methamphetamine.
I had heard that Jimmy Menkins wanted the recipe, then that was why it had happened.
The FBI joined into this investigation fairly early on because there were thoughts of drug involvement. The agent who worked the case for the FBI was George Keeney.
The tips and rumors about Menkins are soon backed up with physical evidence when those fingernail comparisons come in.
They make a confirmation, yes, this fingernail clipping that we've discovered matches this known individual.
While investigators build their case against Menkins, a tipster offers Texas Ranger Glenn Elliott solid information that kickstarts a parallel investigation.
Star Powers was her name. And on the night of the murders, Star came in to the KFC just a few minutes before closing time. She saw an employee on the phone right by the counter, and she heard her say, somebody didn't make the deposit today, there's $2,000 in here. And Star remembered thinking to herself, oh, she shouldn't say that out loud. And she noticed that there were two men immediately behind her. And she thought that they heard the same thing.
There's an unusually large amount of money in the restaurant, and it certainly would have looked like a quick, easy score. Maybe this is a target of opportunity.
What Star Powers told Ranger Elliott was certainly consistent with there being an armed robbery that was maybe just a crime of opportunity.
Powers describes the men she'd seen at the KFC, and the Rangers reach out to local police jurisdictions, hoping one of them can identify these men.
The then Smith County Sheriff had a lot of confidential informants in the Smith County Jail, and he's the one that developed the lead and took it to the Rangers and said, you need to look at these guys, Darnell Hartsfield and Romeo Pinkerton. The there was a warrant out for Darnell Hartsfield for committing an armed robbery in Tyler 3 days after the KFC.
The grocery store robbery happened only 30 miles from Kilcourt and had striking similarities to the KFC crime.
It was close to closing time. They had weapons. They got all of the money out of the register, all of the petty cash money, everywhere they could get money, and they made the women stay laying with their heads on their hands until they got away.
The Texas Rangers put together a wanted poster that includes Romeo Pinkerton and Darnell Hartsfield, wanted for connection and questioning with the Kentucky Fried Chicken robbery.
There were obviously efforts to question them, but at the time, Hartsfield had not been apprehended.
Investigators tracked down his presumed accomplice, Romeo Pinkerton.
Romeo Pinkerton's alibi is that he was still in prison at the time that it happened, so he couldn't have done it.
He was only released from prison a couple of days after the KFC robbery and murders.
After searching for several weeks, Tyler police find Darnell Hartsfield and charge him with the grocery store robbery.
Ranger Dowell interviewed Darnell Hartsfield after he was apprehended.
Though the two crimes are similar, Hartsfield insists he had nothing to do with the KFC murders.
He polygraphed him, as they did with, almost 100 people probably. And he passed the polygraph, and so he was done at that point.
So they quit studying him. That just became a dead end.
All of law enforcement continued to believe that if they kept working it from the Megan's drug angle, eventually things would break open more.
There has to be some sort of justification to take the lives of 5 people. To say that it was a robbery over such a small amount of money seems so horribly mean.
They got a ton of tips. Things developed from a bunch of different sources, and they all circulated around the idea that it was Menkins. They did all kinds of things to try to develop additional evidence. I mean, there was a period of time Menkins was in prison subsequent to the crime, and they wired his cellmate up to get recordings, and they never got anything meaningful.
The fingernail linking Menkins to the torn nail found on Joey Johnson is the only real evidence police have against Menkins, and it's not enough to bring a murder charge. The case goes as cold as the barren ground where these 5 victims were discovered.
It was agonizing. Nothing was being accomplished. And Denise and I did what we could to push the issue. Call and push and write letters and say, hey, something's got to be done.
These people were still out there. It could happen to someone else's family.
On the 10-year anniversary of the crime, there was a lot of press, a lot of media, and the victims' family members went to the local district attorney and asked him to call in the attorney general's office for assistance.
I called every week. I called twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week. And I'm sure they got tired of me calling.
DA Kyle Freeman felt a commitment to these families to get the case solved.
Prosecutor Kyle Freeman asks Texas Attorney General Dan Morales for help.
Dan Morales makes a commitment to solving the case, and he does devote a lot of resources.
In the 10 years since the murders, there have been major advances in forensic science. Investigators will use those advances to take a new look at the fingernail found on Joey Johnson.
When you're dealing with evidence, it has to be conclusive, it has to be tangible. And DNA at that time was becoming such a big word.
The fingernail was submitted to a lab in Dallas for DNA testing that was state of the art at the time, and they did get one result that was consistent with Megan's.
It's enough for the DA to convene a grand jury to weigh the evidence against Megan's.
They were attempting to reach an indictment for Jim Earl Mankins, and I was called as a witness. And there was a sense of relief that finally something, something finally good, because there had been nothing.
Prosecutors take 7 weeks to present their evidence to the grand jury. And finally, this cold case thaws out.
Menkins was indicted and booked for the 5 killings as investigators gathered enough evidence for prosecutors to convince a jury he did it.
We were finally getting somewhere. It looked like it was a beginning to an end.
Menkins waits in jail for his day in court. Prosecutors hope to strengthen their case against him with ironclad forensic evidence.
Eventually, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology was brought in. They were the top of the line, state of the art lab in the world. We were scheduled for a conference call with the lab, and we were all around this big table, and the DNA analyst got on the phone and she said, "Okay, I have results." And we were all looking at the speakerphone, and she said, "Yeah, it's not his nail." You could just hear a pin drop.
All of a sudden, the charges are dropped. I remember just being angry. You kind of lay your hope on something, and you can begin some process of getting some healing, of families moving forward.
After 6 months behind bars, Jim Earl Menkins Jr. is set free.
Everybody was thinking that because of who his dad was, the state representative for the state of Texas, that his daddy was helping him out of it. His dad was keeping stuff hush hush.
How you gonna cover something up with FBI agents, with Texas Rangers, with highway patrolmen, then you got county law, then you got city law? I mean, that's a lot of cover. I mean, there's no way.
The case against Menkins was based mostly on that fingernail, and without it, the case goes cold once more.
We just went back to pushing again, calling, writing letters, and doing what we could. This day and age is, different from back then. Is there anything that y'all could do different now that y'all could have done?
When I was elected sheriff in 1996, I would think about it off and on. I guess I accepted that it was a cold case. That day I met George Keeney, who was a retired FBI agent. That completely changed. Matter of fact, everything changed. I would think about David. Anytime I drove through Kilgore, every time I saw that KFC, it just brought back thoughts. It just over and over and over again. I just felt a desire for justice. Somebody did this. Somebody needs to pay up.
Stroud gives the case another jump start. He brings in retired FBI agent George Keeney, who'd worked the case back in the 1980s.
We agreed the best thing to do was just to take fresh eyes and begin looking at everything again.
Retired FBI agent George Keeney applies new forensic techniques to old evidence from the restaurant. He tests a bloodstained napkin and a cashier's tape box, looking for a link to the killer or killers.
The blood on the cardboard box that had held the cash register tape came back to be consistent with a Darnell Hartsfield. And the blood on the napkin with Romeo Pinkerton.
Both men were suspects back in 1983, but were cleared.
Romeo Pinkerton claimed that he was only released from prison a couple of days after the KFC robbery and murders, and his claim was based on a hurricane, that it was not until after this hurricane had gone through. So it made sense. In hindsight, you weren't able to check things as quickly back then because there wasn't an internet. They were able to check the records, and he was actually released from prison a couple of days before the KFC murders.
We had a meeting with all five families shortly after the hits came in, and once I pulled the wanted poster out and showed them, several members of the family started to cry because you saw the realization that these guys had been there all along, and we just didn't have the science to prove it.
Looking for more, investigators take a closer look at the victim's clothing.
And that's when they use the black light, and they're able to determine that there appears to be semen in Opie Hughes's pants.
That was a huge epiphany for us. Law enforcement had early on explained away her being away from everybody else by saying, well, she's the one who tried to run.
Finding out that Opie had been raped was like getting hit by a train. I never saw that coming, and my heart just broke. Opie was the kindest, gentlest person. She wouldn't hurt a flea. And it's almost like they took the most innocent. I couldn't even process it for a long time.
We submitted cuttings from her pants to the lab for DNA analysis. The lab called and said the DNA result doesn't match Pinkerton or Hartsfield. We just all looked at each other and just thought, oh God, here we go again. There's a third person that's out there.
We had a DNA profile. Surely we're going to be able to find this individual.
The DNA doesn't match anyone involved, including Opie's husband or their original suspect, Jim Earl Mankins Jr.
Well, there was no evidence to tie Mankins to it for so many years. They believe the case is solved. This person did it. Well, they didn't do it. Ms. striation science really didn't hold up in hindsight. And I submit that science has proven.
Oh boy.